Welcome to Hard Talk. I'm Stephen Sackur. Today I'm in Wiltshire, southern England, farming country, where the serene rural views belie deepening economic anxiety, because right now agriculture is under enormous pressure. Spiralling costs, shortages of labour, and a demand that farmers produce more at less cost to the environment. My guest today is Minette Batters. Now, she farms right here. She's also president of the National Farmers Union. As a society, are we asking our farmers for the impossible? Minette Batters, welcome to Hard Talk.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be on your farm, and the sun is shining, and in some ways you would think the sun would be shining on farmers. Food prices are spiraling higher. You would think that would be good news for farmers. Is it?
It's quite extraordinary. I don't think in my lifetime I've ever faced into anything like the cost inflation that we're facing with our inputs now. So we've seen triple-digit inflation on fertiliser, we've seen diesel costs up by 57%, feed costs up by nearly 60%. These are huge price pressures, and of course...
But you've chosen to alight upon the price pressures. I chose to start by talking about the prices you are receiving, because we know that consumers are struggling to meet the prices of the basic foodstuffs that they buy in the supermarket, which makes me think surely the farmers at least are getting the bonus of greater income.
That isn't how it works. So I'm trying to just describe the huge inflation that we're feeling. And then, of course, you've got to pass that on. So if your costs are up massively on where they were in 2019, so price per therm of gas in normal time, effectively 50p per therm, we're now seeing still having the price of gas having come down, we're still seeing it over 150% higher. So of course all of these costs with production, whether that be feed costs, energy costs, fuel costs, someone has got to pay for them. Now there's a limit to what consumers can afford to pay. And then you've got the whole supply chain. You've got the retailer, the packer. So it's about getting a fair return, effectively, for farmers and growers to keep them producing the food that we want.
The Economist magazine, just a couple of months ago, looked at the income of cereal farmers across the country, and they reckoned that their income had risen more than 68% in the last year. Now, we sometimes get a little cynical about farmers. They plead poverty, and yet you dig away at their actual accounts and they're doing rather well. Isn't that the case for at least some farmers even now?
You've got a story of two halves. So for arable farmers, yes, they've probably had a once in 30-year harvest. Don't forget the input costs. You know, fertiliser, they would have the previous year been paying effectively £200 a tonne, and they were paying £1,000 a tonne for nitrogen fertiliser. So they were facing huge input costs. But then, of course, you've got your poultry farmers, you've got your livestock, your dairy farmers, who've got to pay a much higher price for that feed because the global commodity price, as you say, skyrocketed, all driven by Russia invading Ukraine.
Yeah. When it comes to the biggest obstacles to farmers today, you've talked about the shocks of COVID, of the Ukraine war, the various different disruptions and supply chain problems. Isn't the truth that the biggest problem of all with the vote to leave the European Union, and we reckon that roughly half of farmers actually did vote for Brexit. So in a sense, farmers looking at their problems today, many of them only have themselves to blame.
Brexit, I don't think farmers were any different to anybody else. You know, families across the country were divided, farmers were divided. I actually felt that we should remain, and I took a public position on it. Many didn't, of course, so they were divided on whether they wanted to remain in the EU or whether they wanted to leave. Ultimately, we chose to leave, and I think, you know, I personally am enormously grateful that we're in a democratic society and we voted to leave and we've left.
Did the government lie to farmers about what the impact of Brexit would be?
Well, there was one sheet of A4, wasn't there? And there were 3 strap lines on that sheet of A4. The easiest trade deal in history, more money because we won't be investing it in Europe, and a bonfire of regulation. Well, actually, none of those have come true.
And when it comes to the practical impacts of Brexit upon farms like yours, labour is a huge need for agricultural producers. Can your members, the farmers across the United Kingdom, can they get the seasonal workers they need that they used to get very easily from the European Union?
When we were in Europe, we were the preferred country for seasonal workers to come to. We were ahead of Germany, we were ahead of everybody else. People wanted to come here. That's all gone now. So we are bringing people in from very, very challenging parts of the world. There's a lot of cost attached to coming here, and it is very, very different landscape for growers now and seasonal workers. We've had to battle really hard with the Home Office. We started with a figure 5 years ago of 10,000. That's now 45,000. It still has to be agreed on an annual basis. We're saying we've got to have a 5-year rolling programme. The dexterity of this human hand is absolutely essential. We haven't got a robot yet that can pick at anywhere near the pace that a human hand can, or cut, or do anything else.
Last year it was claimed by the NFU that tens of millions of pounds worth of crops were left in the ground, were simply wasted because there wasn't the workforce to harvest them. You presumably tell government ministers that. Have they responded?
I tell them that regularly. Look, we've gone from 10,000 to 45,000 with a potential uplift.
You mean the visas offered to seasonal workers coming in specifically to do farm work?
Absolutely. But we don't simply have enough people who are unemployed here to do the job. So this is holding our whole economy back. It's huge for agriculture, but for the whole supply chain as well.
And when you hear, as I hear, of farm workers from countries like the Philippines, a whole bunch of other countries, who come here and are held in a sort of debt bondage because those who bring them here demand they pay for the visas, for the transportation, and given the sums they are earning on the farms, they remain in debt for months, if not years. What responsibility do you and your members take for these people who come here and live in such debt?
Well, for the seasonal workers scheme, last year and the previous year, the payment rate was set above our own national living wage. So actually you had people coming here that were being paid more than the top of our national living wage. This year, it is an equilibrium across both. So it's really important. We are a highly regulated sector. It's really important that people are well paid, they're living, their accommodation is on site. It's absolutely vital that that is first class and that everybody is well looked after. As I say, we didn't get the badge in the European Union of being the most preferred country for no reason at all. People wanted to come here.
In terms of another EU issue, and that is trade deals, which the British government insisted Brexit would offer amazing opportunities to sign new, better trade deals with countries around the world. They alighted upon Australia, New Zealand as early examples. You have suggested that the deals actually done represent, frankly, a betrayal of British farmers. Well, why do you say that?
I've worked with 3 different prime ministers in the last 12 months and they've all had very different priorities. I feel it was an absolute catastrophe, if I'm honest, to give Australia and New Zealand total liberalised deals. In 15 years there will be no checks and balances. If anything goes wrong, there will be nothing that we can do about it. Now, Michael Gove, George Eustace and many others had maintained these sensitive sectors, and it was decided by Liz Truss at the time that we would fully liberalise. Australia was liberalised and we would too. There'll be nothing that we can do if things go wrong here.
Well, what a negative view of what Mark Spencer, the farming minister, described as a massive opportunity for farmers to enjoy a new dawn, allowing them to break into markets in Asia. He said, with inbuilt safeguards to ensure that farmers are still protected. Was he simply not telling the truth?
So if he's talking recently, he's talking about the Trans-Pacific deal, which is the CPTPP deal. Now, this is what I mean about different prime ministers. You had Boris Johnson, you had Liz Truss. Now, with CPTPP, Liz Truss wanted to start negotiations at 100,000 tonnes on beef. Actually, what they've done with this deal, the Trans-Pacific one, is to negotiate a deal of 13,000 tonnes on beef. You can see that that is a very, very different approach. I'm really pleased that the Prime Minister has listened, Rishi Sunak has listened. You've got a different approach to trade, but don't forget the damage that was done previously. And two of the most formidable countries as far as agriculture goes in the CPTPP are Australia and New Zealand. And what has happened is that, you know, those countries want access to our market for agricultural goods. We want access on services. So we've ended up sacrificing agriculture for services. There's a different approach now, a different mandate. And I think Kemi Badenoch and Rishi Sunak, you know, they get it, but a lot of damage has been done.
See, it's just, I'm thinking you've had, what, 5 years or so in this job. You're the first woman president of the National Farmers Union. You have a powerful voice. And yet, I'm sort of wondering what you've achieved. If one looks at the way agriculture and farming issues have an extraordinarily prominent position in countries not so very far from here, like France, like the Netherlands, where a farmers' movement political party has just scored an outstanding victory in local elections. Farming and farmers in this country simply don't carry that kind of clout. You're their union boss, so where are you going wrong?
I think you're wrong. We led a campaign that brought all chefs, all farming organisations, all environmental NGOs, and we got 1 million people in under a month signing a petition saying that our food standards here mattered on animal welfare and environmental protection, and they didn't want to see them sacrificed in trade deals. So people in this country do care. I think politically they tend to think, oh, farming doesn't matter, it's a backwater.
Why?
I think a long time in the EU, we took food for granted. We had trade flows that went backwards and forwards. You can buy food, whatever you want, whenever you want, 24/7. So I think we have taken our food for granted.
And isn't it partly because you've ceded so much power in terms of the food supply chain to the retailers and the processors? If you look at the price of a loaf of bread, for example, as I understand it, less than 1% of the value of that bread actually goes to the farmer who grows the wheat. That is not true in some other countries, and farmers, in a sense, have allowed that to happen.
You're right. Whether it's something to do with being on an island nation, I don't know, but we haven't collaborated in the same way as other countries have done. So we have let the major retailers effectively take control. This is a unique marketplace here in the UK, and it is a challenging one. And, you know, we've got the most affordable food in Europe per income spend, the third most affordable in the world. So it's been a great success story for consumers. There are tipping points though, and that's what you've seen cracking last year and this year with supply and global challenges on water security, energy security. We've got a great climate here, as you can see. We grow grass. We should be producing much more of what we're good at here.
To continue with the impacts, the fallout from Brexit, one more, and that is, as the UK has left the European Union, so too we've left the common agricultural policy, and the government has used that opportunity to shift the way it supports agriculture in England away from giving farmers basic payments for every hectare of land they own and farm, and saying, no, we'll give you specific payments for particular land management practices, environmental management practices. Is that good for farmers?
It can be. It's not there yet, but it can be. For me, actually, sort of what is missing is the scientific rigour that needs to underpin public monies for public goods. So we committed to farming achieving net zero by 2040, beating the government target by 10 years with the right policies and the right incentives in place. And at the very beginning of this journey, don't forget we've legislated to achieve net zero, so it's going to be happening anyway. But the exciting thing for agriculture is we're an emitter, but we can do something about it. So we should be measuring our baseline first. We've got some of the best science institutions in the world here, Rothamsted, NIAB, the Wakehurst project. We should be measuring the baseline of where we are on soil health, carbon sequestration, so that what's not working we can make better, what is working we can reward. But that isn't happening.
Right, and it's a very complicated system, it seems. I mean, the government has unveiled a plan for England which involves over 200 different practices that they will finance on farms, all connected, they say, to better environmental management. But your own Director of Trade and Business Strategy, Nick van Westenholt, says farmers are going to receive significantly less support. That, of course, will impact their income. So as we make this transition to say farming is less about or focused on food production and more focused on being good custodians of the soil, the water sources and the environment, are farmers actually going to get poorer?
Oh, without doubt. You know, coming out of the CAP, losing direct support, and the current scheme, which is predicated on what we call the income forgone model, so that you have to, you do stuff effectively, but profit isn't built into it.
Our conversation began with you telling me, yes, we are already in a food supply crisis, and now you're telling me that you're transitioning to a new model of supports and payments from the government, which is going to make it much more difficult for you to focus on food production and actually massively reduce your income. I mean, how do those two things sit together?
Well, I don't think food has been recognised as a public good. I would say that producing food is a public good, and indeed if you talk to economists they will say, well, food security is a public good, but food production isn't. We've got to make sure we have the same approach for delivering for the environment as we have for delivering our food. And you know, if we have a market failure situation, you know, the direct support payment was one way of farmers, if their market fell off a cliff, don't forget your office is outside, that they would be able to keep feeding their livestock and keep feeding their families. So there are very, very challenging parts of our country that have been very reliant on direct support.
Do you think farmers are instinctively inclined to be good custodians of the environment? I ask that partly because I see the NFU is still supporting the use of neonicotinoid chemicals, something which across Europe has been banned, but you at the NFU here in the United Kingdom say you still support, despite the overwhelming evidence that it is environmentally extremely harmful. Why do you do that?
Well, let's start with soils first. Every farmer that I represent will say there is no more better investment they can make than into their soils. And indeed, a recent survey we did, 75% of them wanted to be measuring the baseline of where we're at now, which is fantastic.
Well, you mean 25%, a quarter of all farmers couldn't care less about the quality of their soil?
No, that's not the case at all. They might well be.
That's the implication of what you just said.
If you had, 10 years ago, if you had said, do you want to know how much carbon is in your soil? Very few would have actually understood. Carbon back then was nothing. What I'm saying now is the value of carbon and the importance of sequestering more carbon is really resonating, and they want to know much more. The point you make on neonicotinoids, you know, we would lead the world in sustainable production of sugar beet. And the neonicotinoids has been used now in non-flowering crops. We are the only one that is working with the Rothamsted model to signal when you would choose to use that. I mean,
but it's a particular test case. It's a chemical which decimates bee populations, vital to pollination.
Talking about non-flowering crops.
Yes, but the point still is that these chemicals enter the water system. They're very difficult to break down. In Europe, they've absolutely decided that the right thing to do is to ban them. I'm just interested that the Farmers Union, while saying it's utterly committed to getting to net zero, to being a sustainable, responsible custodian of the environment, still supports using this chemical. It's the wrong message, isn't it?
You're not actually right about Europe. France hasn't even used the modelling process on neonicotinoids for sugar beet. They haven't modelled, and they have been able to get derogations to use it, as have other countries. For us, look, we've just got the precision breeding bill through, which will be a game changer. But are we really going to say, with the most sustainable beet production in the world, that we're not going to do it here, we're just going to export our conscience and our production, or are we going to try and do it ever better? We're the ones that are up for trying to do it ever better. Now, the precision breeding bill will be a game changer. that will transform potentially how we deal with challenges of drought, of climate change, but we've got to build bridges to get there. It's not a case of not wanting to cause, we want to limit our food production footprint and step back so we tread ever lighter whatever sector you are. Eating food does cause damage to our environment, but are we just going to say we're wealthy, we'll get it from somewhere else, we'll put all the pressure on other parts of the world? Or are we going to say no, actually we're going to lead the chance in climate smart agriculture, we're going to start it here and we're going to get the rest of the world doing that? That's what will deliver for climate change and what the world needs.
And what that answer tells me is that to be a farmer today, with all of the different pressures, whether they be price pressures, environmental pressures, sustainability pressures, it is an extraordinarily pressurized and difficult job. Personal question, do you think, when you consider your own life and those of your fellow farmers, that this is a profession you think you want your children to go into? Because there's a lot of evidence that many young people are leaving farming, and the demographics of farming are dangerously skewed to the older people in the business.
If I speak to the universities and colleges out there, they're absolutely rammed with young people wanting to come in and have a career in farming. So I think it's changing. For me personally, it's just something that's in my DNA, in my genetics. There is no better feeling than when we are calving, when we are lambing, seeing new life come into the world. I can think of no better job in the world.
And yet 28% of farmers, according to your own NFU Mutual organisation survey last year, 28% of them looking actively at the possibility of giving up.
7,000 businesses were lost from 2019 to 2022. They either consolidated or they got out of the industry. I mean, there's no denying that it is, you don't shut the office door. I mean, I never come back and think, right, I'm going to have 2 days and stay indoors. You are on call 24/7 if you're a livestock farmer, and that's just how it is. But I genuinely think that actually the road that we're on now, the journey to carbon neutral food production, the ability to produce so many more of our fibres, fuel, food in a way that is truly sustainable, I think it is becoming a very, very exciting time. And the young people, when I speak to the young people, they don't have any of the baggage of our generation. They just see this as a really exciting time.
And just a final thought, thinking ahead, I know you have kids, they may or may not decide to be full-time farmers, but if they do, 25 years from now, farms like this, very traditional farms, they may be, in a sense, more sort of environmental conservation centres than they are food production centres. It could be that thanks to AI, thanks to robotics, hydroponic farming techniques, that food production may be incredibly intensive, incredibly industrialised, and not focused on places like this. Would that be a good thing or a bad thing?
You've got to remember that 60% of the country, you couldn't be doing anything else other than growing grass and having grazing livestock. There's a vast proportion of Great Britain that isn't going to be growing broccoli or milling wheat or malting barley. It's going to be growing grass, and something has got to be eating that grass. So, we can't have lawnmowers in the uplands. You've got to have the tearing action that will create the biodiversity by our grazing herds and flocks. And that's what creates the dynamics of our iconic countryside. So I am really hopeful that if politicians can just see the jewel in front of them, that there is a great future. But if we're sacrificed in trade deals, if we're undermined in the marketplace, yeah, it's going to cause devastation out there. But that's my job to ensure that doesn't happen.
Minette Batters, it's been a pleasure being on your farm, and thank you for being on Hard Talk.
Thanks for having me.